Hey guys, kinggath here, and welcome to the June 2019 developer update for Patreon 25 plus subscribers. First off, apologies for getting this to you guys late. It's very much my goal is to always get this to you right at the beginning of the month. To cover the previous month, to talk about the development that happened and upcoming development things, so that you guys can count on that being there. I don't want you to feel like your support is undervalued. I find these videos very important to do, but unfortunately for you guys, not unfortunately for me, is my second child was just born, and so that threw my whole beginning of the month off and just kind of pushed everything back a little bit. So this won't be a regular thing. I will continue to put it on my calendar every month to do on the first of the month to go and record this and make sure you guys get that information in a timely fashion. So now that that's out of the way, let's talk about Conqueror. So I'm not going to recap what just happened, other than to say that the reason for all the focus on bug fixes that happened in the 4.0.10 patch is because of this planned next patch, the 4.1.0 patch, which is going to be focused on what I'm calling phase 2 of Conqueror's life. So if you have followed along with the development, if you've watched a lot of the videos, if you watched my live stream Q&A I did when we launched Conqueror, you'll know that we had some very ambitious goals for this mod. So there wasn't a plan of just releasing it and being done with it. It was instead to kind of do live development of you guys, and that's why you guys are seeing like little chunks of content to our story and new mechanics being built in. Unlike the previous expansions, where we effectively launched it with most of the mechanics in place and we just filtered in a little bit. Instead, with Conqueror, we just started with one of the three major systems we intended to build, and then we're going to just keep adding them. Well, the second major function, or second major mechanics overhaul is coming in the next patch, and that's why I call this the Phase 2 mechanics. So the three things were, we wanted the attack system from Nuka World. We wanted to overhaul that, which we did, and that's what we've been perfecting over the past 6 months. And I think we've got that in a really good space right now. We've got the special units. We've got that nice attack menu. The soldiers now follow you around. You have a lot to build with it. There's still some expansion and improvements I want to do on that, including some AI improvements, some more detailed controls for people who like to micromanage their units in combat and stuff. So some of that stuff will likely come in an unplanned phase 4, where we go back over and kind of hyper polish everything, which is something I like to do with the Sim Settlements content, is periodically just go back over and just really polish it up. But the focus on this is the second phase of it is the outpost mechanic overhaul. So one of the things I really disliked about the Nuka World mechanics and the mechanics that we're currently using in Conqueror is the fact that effectively, when you convert a settlement into an outpost or vassal, you can ignore all of their needs. There's no interesting gameplay in keeping their needs met, other than if you're using some settlements plots and you want them to level up. But if you used the Conqueror pre-build gameplay and you started them out at level 3, well, then there's none of that, and so then you effectively just ignore all those meters, and you just basically make sure you spam a bunch of beds and you're done. There's nothing else to do, and that's not very interesting. So with the Conqueror long term, the plan was to overhaul the Outpost Vassal system and turn the game into kind of a civilization game where you're building up an empire. You're focusing on the big picture, and that was something that I talked about with Rise of the Commonwealth. But with Rise of the Commonwealth, that only played out if you got into the supply line gameplay and you used our city plans, which were intentionally unbalanced. But there was really still nothing forcing you to do that. You were really still largely encouraged and open to just play each of the settlements independently of each other. You could completely redo everything, and so it didn't really capture that feel. And now with Conqueror, we have that opportunity to give you that feel of empire building. Since you're focused on having an army and controlling space, we have all the elements we need to pull off that great big vision. Now, the third phase I mentioned in the Q&A that is not covered in this, but will lightly be touched on throughout the Phase 2 mechanics, and I have a lot of stuff built in here in preparation for Phase 3. Phase 3 is going to be where you can effectively expect to go to war with different factions. So where there will be periods in the game where it becomes more RTS-like, where there's a lot of fast-paced combat and losing control of settlements and fighting for control of them. Like some of that stuff that will come more in a Phase 3. But right now, what we're trying to do is create a system to where you have to come up with a good balance of the number of outposts, the number of vassals, the number of troops, where they're stationed. We want all that stuff to matter so that you can feel like an emperor designing out how they're going to take over control of the Commonwealth. So to pull that off, we had to do a lot of things. So you'll see at the bottom of the screen right now, we've got a brand new HUD. And this is just one of many HUD elements I'm going to be developing for this, because obviously to do a gameplay overhaul as dramatic as we're talking about, we're going to need a lot of information for the player. Now, one of the hard parts about this is that we don't want to overwhelm players who don't find strategy gameplay very interesting. So one of the things I'm trying to do is follow what I think is one of the parts of Sim Settlements that made it very successful, which is the simplicity for new players. So there's a lot of depth under the hood. People who want to get into advanced industrial, into control, doing donations or setting up city leaders, you can do all that. But at the highest level, I want it just to be as simple as filling out meters and you're headed in the right direction. And so the first piece of UI that we've added is especially for that. And I'll describe what this HUD does in a moment, but first I want to talk about some of the overarching themes and kind of the tones we're going for with this major overhaul update of the gameplay mechanics. So the goal long term is to make it feel like you're empire building, and Civilization is the game that I go to for inspiration for that. Whereas SimCity, I think, was perfect for the individual settlements of focusing on getting them upgraded and worrying about their individual needs. I think to go bigger picture, that doesn't quite work as well. So like just worrying about upgrades and stuff. So we needed some new gameplay elements to draw from. Now, it's been many a year since I've played Civ. In fact, I don't think I played Civ 5 or 6. I think Civ 4 was the last one I got really hooked on. So there's probably a lot of cool stuff in Civ that you guys know about that I don't know about. And it's probably a sin for me to not have gone through and played some of those. But I think the Civ I have played is enough of an inspiration. And I didn't draw from it necessarily an exact gameplay mechanics. In fact, I would say far from it. I, for the most part, invented a lot of my own gameplay mechanics. Because just like with the taking Sim Settlements and SimCity and converting it into Fallout 4, most of those gameplay elements and mechanics that are in those God simulator games don't work when you go to first person. They don't work when you're trying to still let the player feel like they're RPing an individual in the world. And so all of these gameplay systems have to be adapted. But when I get stuck on ideas, those are the Civilization are the games I'm going to be going to try and fill the holes and fill the gaps in there. Or when I come up to balance issues, that's where I'm going to look to, because I think they capture that nicely. If you have a little bit of micro of doing things at kind of a individual territory level where you're building up spaces, but then a lot of it is there's a lot of expansion and faction negotiation and things like that going on in the Civ games that I want to capture long term with this. So we had to devise a lot of systems in order to start with this. So in order to make all the balance to come into play, we were going to need some new resources. We were going to need some new stuff you could do with your army, and so that you felt like it was actually fun to engage with all this stuff. So I'm actually going to start with the most fun stuff, because I think that a lot of the stuff I have to show you on these HUDs is kind of boring in mechanically speaking, but this I think is going to be the stuff that's going to get everybody fired up.
Pretty damn well, boss. One thing it needs, though, more food.
Thank you. I appreciate the insight. Okay, so the first thing you're going to see here is that there's a new button on my Raider Recruit called Warrior. So Warrior is one of a new type of system we're introducing. It's a class system. It's also often called the assignments, and will likely settle on one name or the other long term. But just like I have done, you'll see that I often refer to things in some settlements with multiple phrases. For example, we've got martial plots, but you'll see in the messages in the corner it says they finished building security. Like there's a lot of times where I use multiple phraseologies, and that's often because I want one that makes sense to the player, is very clear to the player, and I want another one that feels correct in the in-game lore, especially from the perspective of the fact that the holotape was supposed to be designed pre-war. So a lot of the Sim Settlements mechanics were based around that, and the messaging was based around that. But with Conqueror, that messaging of Old World no longer makes sense. So now I have to come up with new messaging and phraseology for a new reason. So there's an overall tone in Conqueror of Raiderness. Now, the Raider was really just our hook, because I wanted to make sure people understood that we were tying into the Outpost Vassal gameplay of Nuka World, but also that we were adding a new quest line to flesh out that good-evil playthrough. But when it comes to the Outpost gameplay mechanics and anything related to those, even the attacker system, you'll notice that I've been avoiding tagging things with stuff that sounds specifically raidery. I've also been intentionally trying to avoid anything that sounds like it could belong to a particular faction. I don't want things that sound like they're Brotherhood or that they're Minutemen or Gunner or anything like that. I want them to feel more agnostic. So there's two things I've been drawing for the phraseology, and that's medieval phrasing and also more modern stuff. And so that way, when I look to those types of military things and talk about stuff in those phrasing, it makes it easier, because we have kind of a collective vocabulary of gamers, to understand what it means without you feeling like it's tied to a particular faction, and also understanding that it's a gameplay thing and not necessarily an immersion thing. And that has driven a lot. And I know that seems kind of minor to talk about for that long, but it's something that I'm letting you guys know, because as my most, I would say, my biggest supporters. You guys are putting in a lot of money to see my projects go forward. You guys probably are invested in these heavily, and you will be the most likely ones to appreciate stuff like that, but also point out shortcomings in it. So if you see where I'm veering off from that, you might be able to encourage me to get back on track, because it's something I love that Bethesda focuses so much on tone, and I want to continue that as well. So the warrior is one of those points where I went medieval with it in the phrasing of it, and especially because most of my favorite RTS games all tended to be more things like Age of Empires and Warcraft and things like that. So they tended to all be in that realm, and I think that a lot of the RTS genre is. Obviously, there's a lot of sci-fi as well with things like Command and Conquer and StarCraft, but I went into the medieval stuff. I think everybody understands it, and the nice thing about it is that it's less likely to get conflated with a particular faction. So that way, these phrasing and everything can work well no matter what faction players are playing with. Because even though we're focused on raiders with this expansion, whenever I'm designing systems, I ignore the raiders completely. Like they are only in my mind in as much as I want to make sure that the mechanics that we have in mind will work for them in some way. Like I want to think of ways that they can work, but as far as designing the mechanics, it's faction agnostic. All right, so now all that tone talk out of the way, let's get back into this. So when you click on Warrior, you're going to get this new menu, and at the top it tells you the rank of your soldier. If they were a special unit, it would instead say the name of the special unit type they were. The progress is how close they are to their next rank up if they are a regular soldier. Otherwise, that just will remain 0 for the special units. Next is the class. This might be that word class might become assignment. You'll see in other places I do refer to it as assignment, and I'm still debating on which way makes more sense, but that will be there. So and we'll talk about the different classes in a minute. Next is the outpost. It's where they're stationed at, and this is super relevant because one of the things we're starting to dive into is the idea of your NPCs, your soldiers, no longer have to live or have to stand in your settlements. So in the long term, in that phase 3, phase 4 territory of mechanics, I envision you being able to station people almost anywhere in the game world. But right now, you're going to be able to station people at vassals or outposts, as well as set up patrols between them. So showing the outposts that they use as their home is important, so that you can figure out where they're using up plots. So for example, if you've got them set up as a patrol route, you need to know where it is their bed is, so that when you're setting up additional beds and you want to make sure that you actually are arranging for people to be recruited at particular places, that you can do it effectively. So then, and the other benefit there is when you go to the change outpost, you know where you're changing them from. And because NPCs can be stationed anywhere, and you won't necessarily have access to workshop mode to bring up the move command. Basically, you have access to it at any time from your soldiers. Here it brings up that exact same menu. All right, next up we have the Armory Equip option. This is one I wish I would have gotten in the moment that we added the Armory into the gameplay, but I opted against it because I knew that this system was coming, and I wanted it all to be introduced at the same time. I didn't want to hint at what it was coming too soon, and so that ended up getting delayed until this patch. But basically, if you turn this off, you can ensure that if you manually equipped any of your soldiers, they will continue to use that equipment. So one of the common problems with the Armory right now is that players sometimes want the Armory to work with a lot of their guys, but they want to have a few where they deck them out personally. Now you have that option with this Armory Equip toggle. And then the last is, I think, the most fun menu, and that's the reassign menu. So when you activate this, you're going to bring up, and this is where it says assignment type, where you can see I'm still waffling between assignment and class. is that you choose what you want them to do in your military. Now, I'm going to have to talk about a little some phrases that we haven't covered yet for some of the what I said were going to be more boring mechanics. I don't think they will be boring in the grand scheme of things. I think they're going to evolve into a lot of fun gameplay. But I think this is the stuff where I can visually show you how much fun it's going to be, even if you're not interested in the gameplay mechanics, or if you're the type of player who likes to turn off citizen needs and you just want to have fun. This is going to be the bread and butter for you. So guard, when you click this, you choose where you want them to become a guard. And so that will include all of your vassals in your list. So you'll actually be able to assign your warriors or your soldiers. And so here's another thing is soldiers represent any of the people in your army, whereas the classes, this is where I had to make the distinction between warrior and soldier. And one of the places where I had to, where I liked looking to medieval over modern terminology, because soldier it sounds too much like something like Brotherhood. And I wanted to differentiate between a soldier, which is just like somebody that you can do all this, you can control their assignment, versus somebody who has the particular distinction of a warrior, which you'll understand the difference in a few minutes here. But anyway, so you can set them up as a guard, and they will automatically assign to a martial plot or some sort of guard object. So if you're using some third-party mods, it'll look for anything that provides defense that can be assigned to, and it will try and assign them to that. And that's what they will do there. And they will also act as part of the last line of defenses. So one of the things that we haven't touched on a ton of in Conqueror yet is we have in the main outpost. So you'll know, if you've been playing Conqueror for long, you'll notice that the attacks that Conqueror triggers on you pretty much happen exclusively on your main base. They never seem to happen on any of your side ones. And that was intentional, as we know. I know from watching many players play lots of Fallout 4 that most players tend to focus on one settlement as their main base, and so we just kind of leaned into that. And so having all the attacks happen there mean it's very likely that you're going to want to go back there anyway, and it just makes it more enjoyable. But one of the things we want to do long term is overhaul the vanilla system for solving raids off camera, because it's really boring in vanilla Fallout 4. So we are going to be overhauling that, and one of the ways that you will be able to control your effectiveness is with your assignment types, and some other things which we'll talk about later. But that's going to be stuff that's introduced further down the line, but we're kind of getting prepared for it. And guards will add a lot of a new thing called control, which I'll show you that stuff in a bit. But they have the distinct purpose of, it's very useful to assign a bunch of those to your vassals to basically take over the defensive side for your faction so that you can maintain control of that vassal. So this leads me to another change that I got to talk about before we go forward with anything else. There are new default rules that can be turned off with Conqueror, is that in vassals, only your faction soldiers can operate defensive objects, and only the citizens of that vassal, so like all the NPCs that already live there, the civilians and everything, only they can work non-defensive structures. So you can't. So this is ultimately about making sure vassals and outposts play distinctively differently. We don't want you to just play them off of each other where they don't actually matter, where then you just start spamming one or the other for the advantages. They're going to have very distinct purposes, and we want them to have a certain feel to them, where your outposts always feel like they're your military spaces, and the vassals are your supply camps. They're the towns that you're basically taking resources from to fund your military. We want to make sure that they still keep a very city-like feel, or a very supply camp type feel, whereas your outposts feel very much like they're a military installation. And we have some ways to encourage that, which I'll talk about in a bit. But you can assign guards to those, and that's going to be important gameplay-wise. Next up is patrol. And just like the guards, you can actually patrol between your outposts and your vassals. So you actually start, and this is one of my favorite features, is you get to start seeing, especially after you start taking over a lot of the Commonwealth, is you'll see just bunches of your soldiers wandering all over the game world. And they'll just be randomly engaging with people, and it really gives you the feel like you're slowly taking over the whole map, because you're just going to run into your guys periodically all over the place. And again, you'll always have access to this menu from outside. So if you decide that you need to go go grab somebody, you can do that. And of course, you always have access to the town meeting gavel from some settlements if you need to summon back all of your patrols. So it's not going to be like you have to go track down each one or anything like that. But if you do stumble upon them, you'll be able to do things like reassign them. Now, the patrol limit right now, and this might change in the future as we balance things out more, is that they have to originate from an outpost. So that outpost is where they live, and they can go between two outposts or between an outpost and a vassal. And they will provide more of this control score that I mentioned that the guards do. But the difference between a patrol and a guard is that the patrols likely won't be participating in defenses because they will likely they won't be there at the time. They'll be somewhere along the path. But also they provide their control benefit to both ends of their patrol unit, whereas the guards only provide their benefit to the place they're stationed at. So there's a use for both of them. In the immediate release of this patch, they're going to be it's going to be heavily an RP thing and just like a good feeling thing, like a very immersive thing. Long term, it will be very, very important to gameplay mechanics. And then lastly, that we see on this particular menu is the worker. If my guy wasn't already a warrior class, then you would see warrior on this list. Now, and we'll talk about warrior last, but worker is basically means that they will no longer go on attacks. So in fact, so do guard and patrol. Basically, any three of these, you prevent those NPCs from being summoned on attacks, and that is super powerful. As you know, if you played Conqueror much, you have no control over who gets sent on your attacks, and that can be annoying because you lose a lot of access to plots, because then, if the people assigned to particular plots die in combat, all of a sudden those plots are left vacant, and you might lose access to certain benefits. It can be kind of frustrating, and it can also be frustrating if there's maybe somebody you decked out and you're really hoping that they come on the attacks and then they never get chosen, and that can be frustrating. But I don't ever want to get to a point where you have to select individual soldiers to go on attacks with you. It might be one of those optional features people can engage in one day, but I'm always trying to think of this as how can we automate as much as possible with that, while still giving the player some level of control, because I don't want you to feel like you have to micromanage things, because that was the same problem with the vanilla Fallout 4 settlement system, and that you're planting individual crops and you're supposed to be the hero. So something like that assault system, not letting you choose individuals, was very intentional and is going to continue to be the case. But I do want you to have the ability to make sure your settlements continue to function, because as you see when we get to some of these other mechanic talk, your outposts and vassals being functional cities is going to be important. So it's not going to be like the current system in Nuka World and even in Conqueror, due to it just basically using the Nuka World mechanics, is that you can ignore all of that stuff unless you're trying to get plots to level up. We want you to have to continue to maintain functioning places, and we'll do a lot of background automation code to handle a lot of that. Like we'll have assignment rules, auto assignment rules that handle that, and likely in future updates we'll give options for you to let the code take over choices of plot types. There's all sorts of things we can do to automate that, so that way those of you who don't want more minutia gameplay stuff to take care of won't have to worry about that. So a worker basically means, so assigning to any of these takes away the need, or will take it away so that they don't become pulled away for attacks. So then that leaves the warrior class. Anybody indicated as a warrior, which is all new soldiers are by default warriors, can go on attacks. Now, there are a lot of other gameplay elements that we haven't discussed in here that these provide benefits for and stuff, but we'll cover those as we get to them. There's also one class that you can't assign, and that's the captive class. And the captive class will make more sense later. So will the worker class, in fact, once we get into some of the other mechanics. So the two exciting ones are guard and patrol. And I think the worker is exciting in that you suddenly have a way to prevent your settlements your outposts from falling apart mechanically when you send out attacks. As you'll know that the guys that are going on the attacks are the specific ones that you didn't bother to make do anything else, or that you didn't flag as doing something special. All right, so before we go into the new mechanics and what these HUD pieces work like, I want to talk about one of the ways we want to capture that feel of outposts and vassals being vastly different from each other. So one of the ways I'm leaning into it is taking advantage of the different plot types. So you guys have seen that in a recent patch we introduced the Armory, Field Hospital, and Recreational, or the Armory, Field Hospital, and Mess Hall as different martial and recreational plots. And we're going to be expanding that again in this patch. We're going to be adding 4 additional types, and I'm not going to go into those types right now because that's just this video is already probably going to be an hour long, and those are going to be something that I'll announce in the patch video for sure. Another thing I want to bring up for you guys who do make it through this whole video, One of the reasons that I'm doing this, not only to give you guys a sneak peek of it, but I'm also, this is kind of a test of the waters of, and I'm hoping you guys can give me some feedback of how can I explain this to players in as succinct a way as possible. So if you guys have any tips for me on things that maybe I didn't go deep enough in this explanation, or went too deep, maybe brushed over, shouldn't have, etc. Give me any of that feedback, so that way when I get to recording the new set of tutorials for these new mechanics, that I can do so in a way that makes sense for players, so that they can grasp this in chunks, just like I've done with a lot of the other mechanics in Sim Settlements. All right, so one of the things that I introduced those new plot types for, and you'll notice I focused on recreational and martial, and I'll have done again with this new batch of 4 types, is that basically the idea of the split, in order to encourage that military feel versus supply camp city feel, is the goal is going to be that your outposts are going to be most effective with primarily martial and recreational plots, and then obviously residential if you want to do that, or otherwise you can build yourself bunkhouses. And then for the other 3 plot types, commercial, industrial, and agricultural, to be the primary plot types in your vassals. So that's one of the ways we can easily distinguish the look and feel, because it's naturally already the case that the martial plots tend to have a military feel to them by nature, so it'll feel really good for them. And that's where the subtypes come in to give some more variety in that. So not only do they add cool new gameplay elements, which all 4 of the new ones will add some new gameplay elements, whether it be directly interacting with some of these new features that I'm going to show you, or just adding in some extra stuff that have been cool feature requests that I want to support. For example, one of the types I will talk about is battlefield scavengers, which will be a way to automate the looting of all the corpses after these battles, because that can be a very time-consuming and frustrating experience to try and go find all those bodies and grab all that loot, which your settlers would want to make use of. So lots of stuff like that to give you options to give a particular feel to these particular settlements. So now let's talk about these HUD pieces and how the gameplay is going to come out of it. So I'm going to go over these HUD pieces individually, and I'll talk about the stuff you know about, and then when we get to something you don't know, I'll go in more expansive detail on it. So I'm going to bring up the console here so that you guys can see my mouse, and let me make sure I didn't. Okay, good. Make sure I didn't accidentally kill OBS there. So hopefully I can blow this up or something when I edit it in Premiere for you guys. But if we look at the bottom there are 2 new UI elements, and these are just 2 of many UI elements that are going to come throughout the life of Conqueror, because Conqueror is going into such dramatically new territory. And I've gotten over my absurd hatred for Flash. I finally, it's finally clicking with me again. As I learned Flash long ago, back in the day of Flash games, and then I never used it again because I was hoping Flash would go the way of the dodo, but fortunately I've now wrapped my head around it again, so I can start designing new UI elements. And now that I have that power, I really want to embrace it and build cool UI stuff, because games like Civilization and RTS games just feel so much better when you have a lot of information in an easy to digest format. It makes those complicated strategy games just way more engaging and fun. And so these first 2 things I think were the bare minimum we needed to make sure we could get players to embrace all these new mechanics, especially people who don't necessarily like strategy games. So these 2 HUD elements are independent of each other. They both have distinct purposes. I positioned them where I did in order to give me that feel of RTS gameplay, which is they tend to, in most of those games, so not all of them, I know some of them broke free from this trope, but most of them tended to be the bottom quarter to third of your screen was HUD elements to help you play the game, and then the rest of the screen was for you to do that. But obviously, in our world of we're trying to play as a character, I don't want to take up that much real estate. I think that will take you out of it. It won't make you feel like you're playing a character anymore. You'll just feel like you're playing God mode, and that's not what we want to do. We want to have a feel. We want to make sure you still feel like your character. And so those HUD elements are independent, so you'll be able to position them anywhere you want on the screen. You'll be able to scale them up and down, but the default positions are this, in a way that this is a way to make sure it doesn't overlap anything in the vanilla UI. The one exception is when you're in workshop mode and you're going to build things, some of the button activation text does overlap there, and I'm looking into a solution for that. It might be that I just hide those or shift, dynamically shift them or something. I haven't figured out how to deal with that, because one of the things is your HP bar isn't up when you're in workshop mode, so that does give you more room in the corners, so maybe it'll be these jump to the corners, but ultimately you'll have full control over that. So you'll be able to move those independent of each other. So if you want one in the bottom left corner, one in the bottom right, or if you want to move them both up in the top right corner and make them real tiny, you'll be able to do all that. So the left-hand side is your current settlement. So this is showing you a bunch of information about the outpost you're standing in, and then the one on the right is about your empire as a whole. And I shouldn't say your empire; it's your faction. So one of the things that this code does, so this code change that's coming with the next patch, is I completely overhauled all of the underlying gameplay code, and I did that in a way that would speed up a lot of things. So you'll find that things like starting up new assaults is very, very snappy and quick now. But also because I wanted to support a feature that a lot of players have requested, and I intended to support long term, but just for the sake of getting, the first version of Conqueror out in a timely fashion, I didn't put the hooks in early, but I went back and did that, is the support for you to play with multiple factions. So one of the things players have talked about wanting to do is play with the factions as they meet them. So maybe they meet Preston, they start out aligned with the Minutemen faction pack, and they build up with them for a while. Then maybe they build up with or they meet the Brotherhood, and they decide, you know what, I'm going to ally with the Brotherhood, but give them a different set of settlements. Now that gameplay will be supported. So the systems are in place to have multiple main bases and things like that. And that's something that this new code changes will support as well. Now that's something I'm probably not going to advertise heavily publicly yet because it isn't getting its tires kicked, and it's not our initial focus. So our focus for the first release is making sure that all of the gameplay is balanced. So we're introducing all sorts of new resources and things, and new, the new classes for the soldiers. We want to make sure all these numbers feel good and are bug free before we start asking players to introduce complications like, now I have 2 factions to play with, like that. That type of stuff will really throw a wrench into things. So I want to roll that stuff out slowly, which is why we were doing phases in the first place. Is let's perfect one system before we move on to the next, because then we can reduce the frustration players have of patches constantly breaking things. Okay, so then the one on the left there, so let's talk about that first. So now you should see my cursor moving around. So this icon on the left here, so there's these 2 icons. Those aren't just to look cool. So that's what they initially started as. I used that little skull on if you've used the city plan startup thing, you'll know that it had that little skull on there. That was just something to look nice because, I started working past my hatred of Flash. So then I'm like, all right, well, let's make it look pretty. Let's make it look professional. That's what it started as, but it actually has a very particular use, and that's that this will show the icon of Outposts or Vassals. So you can just look at your HUD and know without having to go check your Pip-Boy map whether you have this place as a vassal or outpost. Now, hopefully, you will have designed it in such a way that it's obvious. If you have tons of martial plots and recreational plots, then it's your outpost versus your vassal. But because we're not locking players into that paradigm, which I'll explain in a bit, make a distinct way to make sure is looking just at that icon. And by the way, the HUD framework is going to become a unofficial requirement. Like, it's not actually required in the sense that it's not parented to Conqueror or anything. You don't have to have it, but it's gonna be very difficult to play with the new mechanics without it. So and that's something I'm fine with. I think that HUD framework is pretty much a must-have mod, and it's supported on Xbox, so there's no reason people shouldn't grab it. It's very lightweight, it's supported by everything, and I think the more we embrace it, the more likely other mod authors might finally do so, especially if I can get myself to write some tutorials on building things for it. All right, back to the important stuff. So then next you have the name of the settlement will appear at the top of that particular thing. And then below that is the first of one of the new scores, and that's the control score. So I mentioned this, that your patrols and guards add to this. Your warriors do as well. But basically the control score, the idea is the more resources you're generating, the more you need to defend them. So this is similar to the safety, or the I guess it's called safety in the vanilla game, or maybe we call it defense. Actually, let me check. I know it's called safety in the CK, and in the UI it is called defense. Okay, so it's similar to the defense. The defense, the idea is the more food and water you have, the more defense you have. But it doesn't tend to play out that way necessarily because the penalty isn't enough. There's not enough involved with that. So our control score is similar to that in the sense that the more resources you're generating, the more control you need to have. But unlike the defense score, which needs to just be solved by spamming turrets, ours instead has to do with the number of soldiers you have stationed in particular areas. So this is where where managing your troops is going to come into play, and I think will make it more interesting gameplay to shift people around and make sure that you have the right number of people at each one of your settlements. Whereas currently in the game it doesn't matter. You just kind of you don't care wherever they are stationed. You just spam a bunch of beds in different places and don't think about it, and that's not particularly fun or engaging. So the control score is a way for us to ensure that you have enough people near each of your strong resources. So for your vassals that are producing a lot, you're going to want to set up a healthy number of guards and patrols on, and make sure that you have enough warriors stationed in outposts nearby. And all of those gameplay mechanics, I'm not necessarily going to go into the nitty gritty under the hood mechanics, because I think some of the fun is the mystery of exploring that yourself and coming up with particular strategies, but also because we're going to be tweaking and balancing this over the next few weeks before release, as well as with post-launch as we get feedback from the wider community. So, but the idea of the control score is that you need to have a certain number of troops to match the number of production you have, and also it's going to have different effects whether you have a vassal or outpost on how likely you are to get attacked in that particular place. So the control score won't necessarily always be full everywhere as you're developing your empire. And the places with lesser control scores are going to be likely chosen as easier targets when we get into more, especially when we get into the phase 3 mechanics, which will be, patched some months down the line, which we'll have to do more with, going to little wars with different factions and things like that. Which I don't want to get bogged down by that. That stuff is far in the future. It's going to be, I think it's going to be really awesome stuff. But that control will definitely give us some more room to play with in that regard. Next below that is probably what looks like happiness to you guys, and it kind of is. This is what we're calling morale, and it is somewhat derived from the happiness, so it is a way to encourage you to actually maintain happiness in your outposts and vassals, which what I found is Sim Settlements kind of does that on its own because you can't upgrade your plots. But there's always the problem with when you pre-build level 3 cities, you don't have any, and there's no reason for you to worry about their needs. So I wanted a way to make it so that it's actually relevant to the happiness, and keeping the settlements functioning is relevant. And so that the morale score is one way with that, but the morale will have a lot of other factors that go into it. For example, there will be certain leadership traits that directly affect morale. The success of your recent assaults can have impacts on morale. Your outposts and vassals will each have a different mechanic or thing they're concerned with that will affect morale directly. For example, like the number of captives will have an impact on morale. The ratio of warriors to workers at your outposts will have an impact on morale. And again, these are ways to encourage players to make sure that they are building their outposts to play as outposts and their vassals as vassals. At every turn, I want to make sure that players have reasons to make them feel distinct, because I think it'll add a lot of fun and depth to the game and designing out how the settlements play. So those two mechanics are there, and they will each have penalties for not filling them up. I'm not going to get into those because that's all balanced stuff. But those effectively are your derived scores. They don't necessarily have to be full, but they're kind of moving them in the general upward direction shows that you're succeeding, just like the happiness does in your settlement. So you're not necessarily always worried about filling it up, but the control score will be more in tune with the defense in the sense that you can have a direct immediate impact on it. You can force it to fill up. Morale, we're going to do to an extent will be like that. Like it will refill faster than happiness. It won't be quite as tied down to a delta. Happiness, one of the reasons it fills so slowly is to be like, okay, after you make these changes, the settlers slowly adopt them and engage with them and are happy about it. Ours is going to be a little bit more immediate, but won't necessarily need to be full all the time. And again, a balance thing. We'll talk about that later. Next on this left-hand side, you have the breakdown of your different assignment types. So the first is your warrior class. These are the people that live here that you can send on assaults. Next is the guard, and currently the guard count includes the patrollers, but that likely will get separated out. Right now it's not separated out just for space, because I didn't want to have to expand these, because as you can see, there's actually more wiggle room in on the faction side in this little lower bar. But we also could technically bring these right up against each other. I'll adjust UI. Maybe I'll shift both of them to be wider. There's different things I can do. Obviously, it's my UI element, so I can control it as much as I want. But right now, I think they serve a similar purpose, so it's fine to combine them. But one of the things that long term, when we talk about the control gameplay, is that the number of actual guards, non-patrol guards, will matter. So long term, it's going to be important that we separate those out. But for this initial launch of the patch, having them combined works just fine. But next to that, the little hammer icon is your workers. Those are your people that are assigned just to work, and they're not on patrol or guard duty, and they're not going to be able to go for attacks. This ties in to something to do with the resource generation. So we're going to have to touch over on this stuff. So these 3 meters here have to do with our new resources. So this is one of the parts where you have direct control over things. And we wanted to, again, follow that military feel in our tone. And that, so we have 3 new resources we call wages, rations, and equipment. And these are things that you need to generate in order to support your soldiers. Now, one of the benefits that the workers have is any production they're doing is increased when they're flagged as workers over versus warriors. So warriors can be assigned to things, and they will generate resources while they're assigned to them. But obviously, because they can be pulled off of those things to be sent into combat and might die, it's not going to be reliable. So one of the things that this introduces with having this worker-warrior dynamic is you can use it to power generate out resources. So you can temporarily assign a bunch of your guys as workers to up your resource production so you can speed up the likelihood of recruitment. And it all kind of ties into some of that type of gameplay where if you really want to micromanage, you can optimize and be effective, but it's totally optional. Your stuff will continue to function without you doing that. It's just ways for you to have some power and dive in deep to that. It's that model of easy to learn, difficult to master. So the worker class does that. Workers also have the advantage of they require slightly less resources than your other 3 types. So the baseline idea is that each soldier will require some amount of wages, some amount of rations, and some amount of equipment. And your workers don't need equipment because the equipment is a proxy for things like repairing armor and weapons and ammunition. That's kind of the proxy for it. Just like rations is our proxy for food and water, wages is our proxy for caps. So one of the things you'll notice with our new resources is that there's a couple of things with them. First off, we got away from using physical goods that your player character has. And the reason for that is one of the problems we have with sim settlements is that it's very easy to break the game economy when we start pumping out resources in volumes that are fun enough at scale. So when you think about the fact that by the end of the game, you could have easily 30 to 40 settlements, depending on how much DLC you have installed. And all of those are producing resources. It just magnifies how rich you get, and that's a big problem. It makes it very difficult to balance the gameplay in any meaningful way without also constantly worrying about breaking your base game. And this is one of the things that a mod like Horizon tries to address, of making settlements less advantageous for survival players. Where the settlement system tends to make survival easy mode, and so they try and fix that. Well, I'm going to fix it in a different way, and that's that no longer are the resources generated by the new systems I introduce into sim settlements. They're not going to be goods you interact with. They're strictly going to be representative resources that you can't make use of as a player. It's only resources that are used by the gameplay systems in sim settlements. So in this case, wages, rations, and equipment are all resources that live in a meter form only, and they're used up by the mechanics, but they're not something that you can deal with directly. So it might be that long term we have ways for you to convert goods your character has and do a resource sink, similar to the way you can donate supplies to a settlement, because resource sinks are a great way in the opposite direction of depowering the character, of making sure that players have ways to like make use of all those excessive resources so they don't feel like they're god tier rich all the time. We might introduce mechanics like that, but out of the box with this first introduction of the phase 2 mechanics, it will be a matter of these are only generated and used by the systems themselves. So workers have an impact on that, and I'll talk about how you get those resources in a bit. So next up, we have the civilian class down there. That's the little pit boy or Vault Boy waving. That is NPCs that you have no control over. So in this case, it's Jammer. It might be, if you're in the castle, you'd have Ronnie Shaw would count toward that. If you have Mama Murphy in her chair, she would count toward that. Basically, NPCs you have no control over. Now, in this initial phase 1 launch, that will also count if you're playing a Liberator faction. That's going to count any settlers or civilians that that you rescued. Long term, in fact, in probably one of the early patches, we'll automatically convert those over to the worker class so that they can actually provide benefits to the faction. But one of the things I have to figure out is how to balance that in such a way that it doesn't become a detriment for Liberator players to have a bunch of people that they're rescuing. So I got to figure out what the balance is there in making them making Liberator factions still fun and not a drag. And it might be that out of the box our mechanics are already that's actually an advantage, and then I might have to tone down. So that's a balance problem we'll solve. But I obviously am focused when it comes to balance as far as making sure the gameplay works well. I use the Raiders and the conquering thing as the default to balance around, just because those were the first ones in there. Those are the ones that most players are experiencing with Conqueror, whereas the faction packs, while they have a fairly good adoption rate, are definitely not nearly as much as Conqueror itself. So I have to I'm balancing the Conqueror side first. And then next we've got captives. Captives and workers both have a similar thing in that they cost less resources to have in your militias. They require less pressure on your resource requirements. Captives don't require equipment or wages. So workers require wages and rations. Your warriors, guards, and patrols require all three, and your captives only require rations. Now, right now, that's the extent of the balance to them. They're just it's super advantageous. The captives is definitely one of the systems that's had the least gameplay balancing done around them, but it's definitely something that there will likely be a patch where I focus heavily on that and improving the slaver gameplay mechanics, improving the captive system. Captives ultimately are going to have impacts on morale and the likelihood of other factions coming to try and free them. And so those will get more heavily fleshed out after we make it to the phase 3 of Outposts, or of Conqueror's lifespan. So right now, it's actually a super big benefit to just grab a bunch of captives, because they become super cheap labor. But long term, that's not the plan. All right, so now let's jump over to your faction side, and then we can go more in depth on the different resources and how you gain them. So on the far right, once again, this icon isn't just a pretty picture. That represents your faction type. So the nuclear explosion there is the Conqueror type. There'll be a waving flag type for the Liberators. And if we introduce additional faction types or classifications and gameplay loops, then that would be reflected there. Then above that, you have your faction's name. So if you're playing with Jammer's Gang, it starts out as your gang, and then pretty early on, after you capture 3 or 4 settlements, you get the option to name your gang, and then that will be reflected there. Then below that are your 3 meters for your different resources that are needs. Now, right now, I can see that there's actually a bug in the UI. Those meters are supposed to hug all the way to the right, unless you have a surplus, in which place it'll show you that surplus so that you know how much you're working with. But generally, your goal is to just make sure they're at least full. And if you don't have them full, you'll start experiencing penalties. Now, these penalties are going to be very minor at the launch of this, because I want to encourage adoption to this, and penalties are something that will deter players from wanting to engage with the system. So the penalties will be introduced over time as balancing mechanics and ways, and kind of play that carrot stick game to keep people wanting to actually engage with those. And all of those penalties will be something that can be turned off. Right now, the only penalty that is in place for those that will encourage people to do it, and it's less of a penalty and more of a requirement, is that when those aren't full, recruitment will cease. Now, one of the things that these different resources introduce is something that I really wanted to add at the time we added special units, but the timing just didn't work out. Is right now, the only way special units are handled is they can have a variable resource cost. So the faction pack authors can decide, hey, this particular unit's more powerful, so it costs more resources. Well, the one I mentioned a little while ago is that there's a problem in balance in Fallout 4 with these systems, in that it's very easy to get hyper rich in this game. And so in order to handle that, the resource thing is actually just a token. So there's this little game psychological thing that players tend to be more invested in something if they had to spend something to get it. And so that was where the resource cost on the actual soldiers came into play, as it was a way for players to feel like those soldiers mattered, because they're very disposable. And so I didn't want to completely make them free. But obviously the resource cost almost doesn't matter, because it's so easy to get rich in the game, especially with the mechanics. But it's something that you're investing in. And it's a way for players to actively participate in that. So I know there's actually a lot of, whenever you talk about psychological stuff with games, I think it raises eyebrows, because there's so much predatory stuff going on with loot boxes and things like that try to do that same thing. But I think that stuff's important to build fun gameplay. You do have to think about those things, and I also try and think about those things because I don't want to create addictive gameplay loops that are making people abuse their lives. Like, I don't want to get into a state where we're creating secondary outlets for gambling addicts and things like that. So I am aware of all the psychological tricks that can go into making people hooked on things, but I try and use them responsibly, and I hope I have been doing so. So if any of you thinks that I haven't been, and there are mechanics in sim settlements that are triggering for addictive personalities, please let me know. I definitely don't want that to be a default setting. At least I'd like that to be something opt-in. Anyway, so that was a sidebar. You can see the actual number of recruitment resources you have here, but the recruitment resources tend to not be a good balancing element because it's so easy to get rich. So now with these new resource types where you have to have requirements for each of your soldiers, this will be a great way for add-on or faction pack authors to balance their units. So they can maybe have a mercenary unit that requires higher wages, and maybe they're a little stronger, or maybe it's a way for them to have more immersion. So for example, if for the Brotherhood faction pack, maybe they want to have vertibirds, and those aren't going to require any wages or rations, but require a really high equipment score to maintain them. Like, they can do things like that, so they can give more immersion and they can do more balance. Similar to the way a lot of the building plans in Advanced Industrial or from Industrial Revolution would have negative impacts on your happiness or your defense and things like that. This is our equivalent for the military units, is that you can affect these ratings in some way. So you basically can have a heavier requirement. So basically, as long as these aren't met, your recruitment is ceased. So that's going to be the encouragement there. Now, one thing that we didn't talk about here is right now we're in Sanctuary, and I have built nothing here. I literally just took this over before the demonstration for the sake of showing it, and then I wandered off, and when I came back, all the faction decorations have been placed. But I haven't built anything yet, but you'll see that my resource meters are partially full. And that is because one of the things that I wanted to avoid was making it hard for players who like the current system of recruiting soldiers and making attacks to engage in it as often as they like. So what I've done to combat that is that by default, your HQ automatically generates enough resources to support five warriors, so that you can always, at any given time, as long as you dump enough resources into the ham radio, you'll always be able to sleep and recruit enough guys to run an attack the next day. So no matter what, no matter how bad of a manager you are, you can always run attacks. That was kind of the baseline there. And it acts similar to, if you look at games like RTSs, like something like Age of Empires or StarCraft or Warcraft, where you tend to start out with something. You start out with a command center and a few basic units. This is our equivalent of that. You start out with a baseline, a level of resources that you can never lose. You'll also find that you can never lose control of your main base. So that's kind of your sacred space. Now, if we were doing more of a scenario gameplay where you were meant to lose the game, if you lost your HQ and have to start over, it might be worth talking about losing it. But because we're trying to maintain that feel of you're still your character, we're not trying to take over all of Fallout 4. We want this to be a layer on to Fallout 4. We don't want you to have to restart. So your HQ is always kind of a sacred cow. Nobody can take it from you. It's your last bastion to rebuild from. It might come under heavy pressure, and it might be under constant attack, and fortunately, because you can just get involved with combat yourself, you'll always have methods of dealing with that. But it will always be, and you could do things like send your companions there who are invulnerable defenders, so you always will have ways to make sure that your HQ can be rebuilt from and you can build back up. So even when we get to phase 3, where there can be the loss of control. And when I talk about these loss of control things, anytime there's a system that can be a negative impact where it can change things without your authority, I try to always make those systems optional. So I want any system that will take away your ability to have freedom of choice and impact on things. Those systems always, I try to make sure those are toggleable. So any of the stuff I'm talking about that you don't like the sound of, you can just turn it off. For example, the requirements for those resources in order to do recruitment can be turned off. So that's an option in the holotape, and will be an MCM as well at launch. So you'll be able to turn off the requirement. But basically, so not only does that allow for new balance, it breaks free of some of the problems with tying into vanilla stuff to get you rich. And we also did one other thing, which we shifted something that I always disliked in the vanilla system. Is the vanilla system uses a power of ones. So everything is based on one resource. You need 1 food and 1 water per person, and 1 defense for each food and water you have, and things like that. And it's all ones. It makes it very simple to understand and explain to people. But as you can see with Sim Settlements, I introduced the dynamic needs system because I thought that was boring to have that 1-to-1 ratio. I like to be a little more dynamic, and the HUD from Sim Settlements reflects that. But even with the way we balanced out some settlements, we were always battling the fact that we had to keep the numbers relative to the one-to-one ratio that Bethesda did. Because so then, when we add an impact, if we want to have a heavy impact, it's still got to be relevant to the one that the player's used to, because that's kind of their anchor point of what they accept as the normal amount. So then if we said negative 10 food, they're going to think about that in relation to that normal 1 food, and it's going to sound like a big deal. And so that meant we had to keep our numbers fairly close to 1, which doesn't leave a lot of room for balance. So what we did with the Conqueror mechanics, and what we'll all be doing with all new mechanics introduced with Sim Settlements going forward, is we go up to a power of 10. And so when we talk about the wages, rations, and equipment needs for any individual, it's based on numbers of 10. So the default soldiers require 10 wages, 10 rations, 10 equipment. And because this is an abstract system and not a resource directly controlled by the player, we can do that. We can go that way. Another cool thing is that leaves wiggle room in the negative direction for special units for faction pack authors. If they want to make a less powerful unit, they can make it cost less. So maybe they want to do, like a super mutant faction wants to do their warhounds cost, or they're less powerful than a super mutant. So maybe they require half rations or something like that. Or maybe if we want to go immersive side, they just probably require only rations and no equipment and wages, and it can be balanced that way. And so having it in powers of 10 lets us balance. We basically then have 10 points to work with on the lower level and unlimited on the higher level. So we've got a lot more wiggle room to play with. Whereas in the vanilla game, we have to keep everything, since everything's based on ones, we don't have a lot of space to move because you can't really do like quarter or halves. Otherwise, it causes problems with UI. It just won't be reflected to the player. So by moving to powers of 10 and having control of all of our own HUD elements, we have tons of room for balance. So that's something that's pretty exciting about this new system. Once again, I'm going into extreme depth here to give you guys all this information as the backers, thinking you guys will be interested in it. Then definitely comment, let me know what stuff, I need to, what is the stuff I should cut out when I get to the in-depth videos, or when we get to, I'll likely do a live stream Q&A again with these new mechanics. What are the stuff I should cover and what I shouldn't? Would love to hear that from you guys. And so because this is tied into recruitment and players are going to want to plan out things, if you have access, it'll show a positive number. So if you saw plus 50 next to each of those, you could do the math quickly in your head. No, okay, I can get 5 more guys, right? Then you can make those number adjustments very quickly. That's another benefit of going to that power of 10. Is the math is still easy to do in your head. And you see a lot of games do that. That tends to be the numbers that like Blizzard likes to use with StarCraft. For that same reason. This just makes it easier to balance and still keep the math simple in players' heads. Okay, so next on our HUD, and let's get the console back up, we have our bed icon, and that's to show that you do have to have beds still for your soldiers, and you will have to have beds even for the guys that are set on guard duty or patrols, even though it won't be reflected in the vanilla mechanics, just because the way the vanilla game calculates all this stuff, it's based on where the settler is assigned. And so in order to support things like having them assigned outside of the settlement, we had to turn the bed requirement into a global thing, which it kind of was anyway in Conqueror before this, in that the number of beds was calculated on a total outpost level to determine whether or not more soldiers could be recruited. So that continues to be the case, but now there's a UI element to correctly reflect it. So 8 out of 8 is showing up here, but if I had assigned somebody to be a guard at some other settlement, this 8 out of 8 would remain there, even though in this settlement it wouldn't necessarily be true. So again, that's why this is the faction total. This right-hand side is how your whole faction is doing. Next up on there, I already showed you, is the recruitment resources you have remaining. And then the last one there is the total number of warrior class. And so by default, all new soldiers are warrior class. And the special units that the faction packs create can override that. They can set up default classes for their particular unit. So if they have, a special unit that's designed only to be a guard or only to be a worker or something for whatever reasons they want, I love to leave that stuff open for their interpretation. It won't default them to a warrior, but all the default recruits that that every faction has access to, the guys that can rank up, your rank and file soldiers, they will always default to warrior and they will show up here. That might be something I change in the future with rules that you can set. Like maybe I set it up so it's something, there might be a holotape option we add where it's any assignment to any of the 3 production plot types, which actually I may have just glossed over that and not talked about that. Okay, let's double back. I don't think I talked about that. So the primary way you have of getting access to these resource types is wages come from commercial plots. rations come from agricultural plots, and equipment come from industrial plots. And there are a lot of multipliers and things that go into that. But basically, and I'm not going to talk about specific numbers of how those are generated, but basically, by tying it right into plot types, we do a couple of things. One is that we can encourage those plot types to be the one that exists exclusively in vassals, whereas they're less valuable in your outposts, where you're going to want recreational and guard posts or in martial plots, because that's where we're introducing all of those new subplot types. So in a previous patch, we introduced the armory, the mess hall, and the field hospital. With this patch, there will be 4 new plot types along those same lines, all being tied to either martial or recreational. So all of the ones that give advantages to your soldiers, we're going to be on recreational and martial, and all the ones that create your new resources are going to be on the other 3. And so not only are you going to be encouraged in the sense that you have all these new functionality you're going to want in your outposts with these new subplot types of martial and recreational, but we're also providing a boost to the generation of these 3 in vassals. So you're going to be very highly encouraged to make your vassals primary resource producers and your outposts primary military functionality. And so the total, so maybe it will be something like, if a guy gets assigned to one of those 3 plot types, then they automatically get classified as a worker. That's what I was getting at before I realized I'd never bothered to explain how you get these resources. So basically, we might set up some rules like that. So that, again, I want to look for ways to automate the class assignments and minimize the amount of micromanaging you guys have to do, so that you can, maintain playing as your character, with this stuff being kind of a sub element you can engage in, but you don't have to micro. All right, so then let's talk a little bit more about the different resources, because that's something that gets important, obviously, since it controls your recruitment. Long term, we'll have additional impacts that'll be immersive, and they will add extra layers. All of them will be optional. We're thinking things like deserters when you can't reach certain resource amounts. We're talking about things like health reduction or combat effectiveness, stuff like that will all come into play. Those will be more hardcore options. Will likely be optional. But I think the recruitment one alone is enough to work for our initial launch. Long term, we are going to need more than that, though, because otherwise, once you get your army to a reasonable size, you can just ignore them once again, and then we're in the same boat we were before, where the player doesn't have to actually care about how successful their particular places are. So in order to further encourage that, we've got 2 things going on. Vassals have a bonus to production of those 3 resource types. Workers have a bonus to the production of those resource types. We've got the morale tie-in to effectively want more warriors than workers in your outposts, and all of these different systems are in play to make it so that you're encouraged to have a more balanced number of outposts and vassals. Now, we'll give a lot of wiggle room and time. We'll introduce things. One of the upcoming patches will add a bunch of new leader traits that are outpost focused. So there's we've already got a bunch of custom characters designed for Jammer's Gang that we've been sitting on for a while, waiting for this. That will add a bunch of that of those traits, and we'll almost certainly have a new set of traits for each of the companions, so that as you get later in the game, say you have Preston, we'll have him a set of military focused traits, so that when you assign him as a leader of an outpost, that it will be reflected accordingly. So we're going to have all sorts of stuff coming down the pipe like that, and those will be able to impact some of these different things. So maybe they'll have bonuses or negatives to the production levels of those types. They'll have things like increasing the max number of people you can recruit. There's all sorts of new things this opens up by having these new mechanics. So we'll be able to have a whole new set of traits, which will add a fun new layer. And then obviously the special units will start to be able to impact that. So this opens up just a Pandora's box of new options that we can play with. And by default, we're keeping all of the balance tied to the plot types. All of the balance is kept within the actual code base. So one of the mistakes I made with Sim Settlements was opening up, and I won't call it a mistake. I like keeping things open like that. But what it turned out to be a mistake is that by letting add-on pack authors mess with the stats, it can create an incongruent experience for players. So sometimes they'll build, they might build a random plot and expect it to have X impact on their meters, and instead it has a far higher or far lesser impact, and then that can make it harder for them to plan. So for example, there are some agricultural plots that produce virtually no food but produce happiness. If they got that as a random selection, that can be very disappointing. So that, especially in the early game when you're expecting X number of agricultural plots to plan around. And so by default, default, for now at least, until we expand on this further, the resource types are only impacted by plot type. There are no sub modifiers that can be manually applied by add-on pack authors. And again, that might change in the future, but I want to make sure first that we have a good baseline that's balanced, and that way I can, when I start teaching add-on pack authors about these changes and things and how they can have that effect, that I can make it very clear to them what the impact will be. Because right now I don't think that a lot of people thought about that long term when they made those major changes to their building plans and stuff, about how that would impact player experience. But I'm acutely aware of it for this, and because we're designing this whole new system, totally new, and while we're kicking the tires on and test it in the back end, I know it's going to have to go through multiple iterations of balance. So I don't want to have add-on packs making that more difficult for us. But long term, I do want to open up that system so that other, not only add-on packs, but other mods in general can have impacts on these things and can start to engage in our new systems. So I think that covers most of it. Like I said, I think most of the fun is going to come from filling up these meters, in the sense that it gives you goals, and more importantly is that new reassignment type of your soldiers, so that you can manipulate where they go. And one of the things that I was going to show you on the video, but I unfortunately have I picked an unstable save to play with, and it crashes when I cross certain cell boundaries, so I can't use this save to show you guys. I was going to show you a vassal attack, and I tried it at the beginning of the video, and it kept crashing the game still, so I just decided to just talk you through it. But basically, one of the new things that's on by default and is optional is that and I may have already said this, I apologize, this video went longer than I anticipated, but in Vassals, only your faction NPCs can work the martial plots, and only those civilians, the settlers and civilians that are living in the vassal you captured, can work the other plot types. And that creates this interesting dynamic where when you go visit them, you get a presence of your settlement there. You always have your faction there. It also plays into this control gameplay of being able to assign guards. And one of the ways to speed that process up so it's less frustrating and micromanagey is that once you capture a vassal, one of your attackers will be assigned to each of the martial plots automatically, so you don't have to do anything. And that option can be turned off as well. The restrictions on assignment can be turned off, but the goal again there is that when you show up at a vassal, it feels like it's a vassal. It feels like you've got a bunch of guys under military guard, or for the liberators, it'll feel like that you have them protecting the settlement. You can immersify yourself through it however you want, and you just to have some sort of presence, so you can see at a glance, without even experiencing the HUD, that your faction does have a permanent force there. Some of the things that I've also considered and might become options are to have the faction skins apply in the vassals as well, though I'm not positive about that. I definitely don't. I'm not, and I could also do things like the faction decorations could apply to those. There's all sorts of things we could do to give more of an impact, but I think just having your guards stationed at their outposts and their martial plots in the vassals at their martial plots has a real big impact, and then seeing your patrols wander around is a ton of fun. So I'm hoping players get excited for this. I'm hoping you guys can give me some feedback on what I should teach people. If you felt like I glossed over something too much or didn't give enough information, I would love to have that from all you guys. Thank you so much, as always, for your support. I hope you guys are as excited about these new mechanics as I am, as we are, as on the Conqueror team. We definitely have a lot of quest content coming that will also teach these mechanics, but that's probably going to be delayed a little bit because just getting these outpost mechanics done for a single patch run, even with an extra week or two, was very challenging. I had been doing a lot of the code secretly. A lot of this code is actually already live. It's just disabled because I had to do it over months. This wasn't something I could do, in a single patch cycle. But even just polishing it up and enabling all those systems and testing them was challenging enough. But we are going to integrate this with Jammer's questline so that you'll be taught these mechanics as you go through them. In fact, at the tail end of some of the Phase 2 stuff, we'll even be expanding on them into the tail end of the story. So we'll be weaving some of this stuff into the story, existing stuff, so that if you go back through and play again, you will see some new dialogue scenes play out and some new mentions from Jammer to kind of teach you this stuff. We'll introduce new pop-ups and UI elements and things like that to train all this stuff. So lots and lots of big stuff coming from Conqueror. So I didn't talk about anything related to our future expansion. The only thing I'll say is that likely the likely plan, and this is really tough to say because I don't know where the other expansion is going to be, and that expansion is on it goes until it's finished. It's not like in before what I've been like with Conqueror, we're experimenting with live development. Previous expansions, I set pretty hard deadlines and we just raced toward them and come hell or high water. This next expansion, we're doing it as if we were doing a retail release. Like obviously we're not selling it or anything, but we're treating it like that. We want to get away from the stuff that's pissing off players in the game community, the early access lies, which kind of is what Conqueror is, but I figure we can get away with it because we're doing it for free, and because we're not AAA, we're not even microtransactions. We're just experimenting, but we want to have a fairly bug-free experience that comes out mostly feature complete on day one, and so that's a ways off. But the current plan is we'll likely drop that between phase 2 and phase 3 of Conqueror. But if the development of that project goes on longer, then you might see phase 3 of Conqueror sooner. So that's why I didn't dive too much into the phase 3, the control gameplay stuff, because it might be a long ways off. But in the grand scheme of things, that is a direction we're heading. And I'm really, really excited for that. I think that will totally change the late game feel of Fallout 4. And I hope you guys are ready for all these big changes. And I hope I did a good job explaining it. I hope you guys can give me some feedback on that. And definitely in the feedback, not only on how I should teach this or where I should dive into more information, let me know if there are any of the mechanics I mentioned where they sound intimidating, scary, or where you want to make sure they're toggleable. And I'll make sure that I get toggles in those. All right, guys, all that said, take care and thank you for your support.